And joining us now in studio for more is Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of United Nations Watch. Thanks for joining us, Hillel. Now, in this announcement on this renewal of funding, the State Department took great pains to say it is within the bounds of U.S. law, a reference presumably to the Taylor Force Act that prohibits direct funding to the Palestinians because of their so-called pay-for-slay policy that gives payments to Palestinians that have committed violent acts against Israelis and are in prison. Do you feel that this funding is in the bounds of the war, or is it just sort of a maybe even within the letter of it, but not within the spirit of it?
Look, Kalev, I support aid to the Palestinians, but I think the United States made a mistake in deciding to give $150 million to UNRWA, an agency that, according to the Swiss foreign minister, is part of the problem and not part of the solution. The Swiss foreign minister said that UNRWA perpetuates the conflict. He said funding UNRWA, supporting UNRWA, is a perverse logic. The point of UNRWA is not to solve the refugee problem, it's to perpetuate so-called refugees.
All right, well, I want to read out the U.S. State Department section of that statement specifically dealing with UNRWA. It said, the United States is deeply committed to ensuring that our partnership with UNRWA promotes neutrality, accountability, and transparency. As with all of our engagements with UN institutions, the United States needs to be at the table to ensure that the reforms advance efficiencies and are in accord with our interests and values. So the argument here is that if we're not at the table, if we're not funding UNRWA, we're not going to be in a position to ensure that that material is not does not constitute incitement.
Sure. Look, we appreciate U.S. engagement and I would say leadership at the United Nations. But UNRWA is an agency that has a long record of being dedicated to perpetuating the conflict. There are 2 million Palestinians in Jordan who have Jordanian citizenship, who've been there for 7 decades, who are called refugees. They're not refugees. If you have a Jordanian citizenship, you're not refugees. The same goes for Palestinians who live in the Palestinian Authority. Why are they refugees? Refugees from where? They're living in the Palestinian Authority. They're living in Palestine. So there is a lot of politicization. The entire purpose of UNRWA is to perpetuate the conflict. Now, the U.S. statement talked about neutrality. That's a reference to things like we've reported about incitement. UNRWA teachers, if you go on their Facebook pages, we found UNRWA teachers glorify terrorism. They post pictures revering Hitler. They incite to anti-Semitism. We have documented about 150, 200 names of UNRWA teachers. We've sent them to the U.S. We sent them to the Obama administration. Nothing happened. We've never heard one announcement from UNRWA about a teacher who was fired for praising Hitler. And the notion that the U.S. is going to hold UNRWA accountable, I'm skeptical. We're going to send material to Secretary of State Blinken. We're going to demand accountability, but I'm skeptical based on what the U.S. has done before. They have not in the past demanded any accountability from UNRWA.
All right. Well, I'm certain we'll be going to be hearing more about this issue certainly in the coming months as that funding is renewed. Hillel, stay with us because I want to move to another diplomatic, let's say, issue involving Israel and the Palestinians. Now, Israel today announced its response to the International Criminal Court in The Hague over the decision by Chief Prosecutor Fatima Bensouda to open an investigation into alleged war crimes by Israelis against Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, the Israeli government, as expected, is telling the ICC, we will not cooperate with you because you don't have the authority to probe us. A statement from the Prime Minister's office says, in part, in addition to completely rejecting the claim that Israel commits war crimes, Israel reiterates its unequivocal position that the Hague Tribunal Court has no authority to open an investigation against it. The wrongful intervention of the tribunal lacks any legal basis and is contrary to the purposes for which it was established. The State of Israel is committed to the rule of law and will continue to investigate any charges against it, regardless of its source, and expects the tribunal to refrain from violating its authority and sovereignty. And Hillel, let's look at the legal basis that Israel is claiming that it has in rejecting cooperating with the ICC on this probe?
Look, the ICC investigation has no basis in international law. They are giving themselves jurisdiction over a non-member state, a state that never signed on to the Rome Statute of the ICC, at the request of a member.
Which is Israel, which never signed on
which
to
is
the,
Israel.
Right.
Like the United States and other countries did not sign on to the Rome Statute of the ICC, at the request of a member, the Palestinian Authority, they call it the State of Palestine, which is not a state. So this has no basis and no precedent. And the fact is that the ICC was created in the spirit of the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II.
Right, something, remember, we're coming off of Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Today,
so
in Israel's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Certainly worth remembering that context.
Worth remembering the context that the idea of the Nuremberg war crimes tribunals were to go after the worst atrocities known to mankind. And the notion that that is now being used against a democracy that has defended itself against terrorism. They talk about the 2014 war, how Israel acted. This is Hamas fired thousands and thousands of rockets at Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and other major cities, certainly in the south. And Israel's defending itself from international law. Maybe mistakes are made. Maybe there are violations here and there. But the notion that the ICC would involve themselves in the case of a democracy defending itself against thousands of rockets is absolutely the opposite of what it was established to do. It's a complete subversion of the idea of war crimes investigations.
Well, let me ask you, the Biden administration has said it agrees with Israel that there's no jurisdiction here. But at the same time, it did remove sanctions that were placed against the prosecutor, Bensouda, that had been placed on the Trump administration, which suggests certainly a different approach to the ICC. Should Israel be concerned about the Biden administration's approach to the ICC?
I don't think that the removal of sanctions themselves should be a significant concern for Israel. Clearly, the Biden administration is going to take a different approach to dealing with international institutions, and imposing sanctions on court officials is a rather unusual act that happened in the previous administration. I don't think Israel will be concerned about that. But other decisions that the administration is making, for example, in Geneva, where I'm based, the Human Rights Council, the administration is praising the Human Rights Council, is portraying its latest actions in a positive light. I think there is a series of decisions that Israel may have some concern about.
Right. Again, I would say the Biden administration is used the same argument. We have to be engaged in order to have
which has some merit. And the Human Rights Council, there is some merit to being engaged, but they shouldn't portray its actions, whether against Israel or supporting Cuban resolutions that are against individual human rights, as positive actions.
Hillel Neuer, United Nations Watch, thank you for joining us.